I'm not here to save a world, Commander John Taylor muttered under his breath as his boots crunched on the icy surface of Zyron. The planet was dying, and so was he. Blood trickled down his side from a wound he didn't have time to treat. But there was no choice. He had to keep moving. He had made a promise. The world of Zyron had been under siege for months, its people crushed under the boot of a ruthless empire. And in the middle of all this chaos, there was John, a soldier sent on a mission that no one believed could succeed. His task: find the artifact hidden deep in the heart of the enemy's strongest fortress. But with every step, the ground seemed to tremble, as if the planet itself knew what was at stake. The battle wasn't just for Zyron anymore. It was for the future of the entire galaxy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape, John paused. In the distance, a faint light flickered, a signal. Nira. She had been his reluctant ally from the start, a fierce warrior from Zyron who had joined forces with him out of necessity, not trust. She was still standing at the edge of the battlefield, watching him. John couldn't help but wonder what went through her mind. Did she still believe in the cause, or was she just as desperate as he was to survive this nightmare? He could feel the weight of their silence, the unspoken bond between them that had formed in the heat of battle. "We can do this," he whispered, more to himself than to Nira. The sound of approaching footsteps broke his concentration. Nira was already beside him, her expression unreadable. "We're getting close," she said, her voice low. "But we're also running out of time." John nodded. The enemy was closing in, and every moment they delayed increased the chances of failure. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. Together, they moved toward the glowing signal in the distance, knowing that every step could be their last. The cold wind bit at their skin, but neither of them flinched. As they reached the edge of the enemy's base, John's heart pounded in his chest. The mission was clear, but the path to success was anything but. "Ready?" Nira asked, her hand on the weapon at her side. "As ready as I'll ever be," John replied, drawing his own blade. The tension between them was palpable, a mix of determination and fear, but they couldn't afford to show weakness now. They were too close to failure. John took a deep breath, focusing on the task ahead. They would face whatever came next together. There was no turning back now. The fate of Zyron, and perhaps the entire galaxy, rested on their shoulders. John and Nira crept through the narrow passageway, the sound of their boots barely audible over the whistling wind. The base was ahead, its imposing structure casting long, cold shadows under the dim light of Zyron's twin moons. John could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on him with each step, but he didn't dare show it. Nira moved silently beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. "We're almost there," she whispered, her voice barely a breath against the wind. John nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They had come so far, faced so many obstacles, and now the moment of truth was within reach. They had no choice but to succeed. As they approached the massive door of the base, John's hand instinctively reached for the small device at his belt. It was a simple tool, but it could make the difference between life and death. With a soft click, the door slid open, revealing the heart of the enemy stronghold. The inside was eerily quiet, the walls lined with strange alien technology. John felt a shiver run down his spine, not from the cold, but from the realization that this was the final stretch. This was where the artifact was hidden, the key to saving Zyron, and perhaps the entire galaxy. Nira stepped forward, her expression unreadable, but John could sense the weight of her thoughts. She had grown up here, fought for her people, and now, here she was, standing at the precipice of their future. The tension between them was palpable, but they couldn't afford to waste time. "Stay sharp," John said, his voice low but firm. Nira gave a small nod, her eyes never leaving the dark hallway ahead. They moved as one, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the high-tech flooring. Every corner, every shadow, felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. But they didn't stop. They couldn't afford to. They reached the central chamber, where the artifact was said to be stored. The room was vast, its walls lined with intricate alien symbols that John couldn't understand, but they had no time to decipher them. They needed the artifact, and they needed it now. As they entered, the door slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud, and the room was plunged into darkness. A low hum filled the air, the sound of energy charging. Nira stepped forward cautiously, her hand outstretched. "It's here," she said, her voice a mix of hope and uncertainty. John moved beside her, his heart racing. The artifact was a glowing orb, suspended in midair by some kind of force field. It pulsed with a strange energy, casting an eerie light across the room. "This is it," John said, his voice barely a whisper. "The future of Zyron depends on this." Nira nodded, her eyes locked on the orb. But before they could make a move, the air around them shifted, and a voice echoed in the room. "You think you can save this world?" The voice was cold, filled with disdain. "You're too late." The voice echoed in the chamber, cold and menacing, sending a chill through both John and Nira. "You think you can save this world? You're too late." John tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but the voice was unlike any they had encountered before. It wasn't just a threat. It carried an air of certainty, as if the speaker knew something they didn't. The orb before them pulsed brighter, its glow now casting an unnatural light across the walls. "Who's there?" Nira demanded, her voice sharp, but the room remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the room. It was tall, its form indistinct, surrounded by a swirling mist of energy that made it hard to focus on its features. John's heart raced. "Step forward," he called, trying to steady his breathing. "We're not here for a fight. We need that artifact." The figure moved closer, and John could now see it more clearly. A tall alien, its skin shimmering like liquid silver, eyes glowing with a cold light. Its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with a strange pressure. "You misunderstand," the alien said, its voice both soothing and terrifying. "The artifact does not belong to you. It is not meant to save your world. It is meant to destroy it." Nira stepped forward, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "This artifact is the key to saving Zyron." The alien smiled, a cruel twist of its lips. "You believe that? You are nothing but pawns in a game much larger than you can understand. The artifact was never meant to save Zyron. It was meant to keep it contained, to prevent your kind from spreading beyond this world." John felt a wave of confusion wash over him. He had thought they were so close, that this artifact was the answer they had been fighting for. But now, doubt began to creep in. "Then why help us at all?" John asked, his voice steady but filled with frustration. The alien regarded him for a long moment, its glowing eyes piercing into him. "Because I am not your enemy," it said. "But the true enemy is not of this world. It is something far older, far more powerful. And it is coming." The words hit John like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" Nira demanded, her hand tightening on her weapon. The alien's gaze softened slightly, almost with pity. "The real threat is not the forces you see before you. It is what lies beyond the stars. The artifact was meant to keep Zyron isolated, to protect it from what is coming. You were never meant to succeed." John looked at Nira, her expression a mix of confusion and anger, and for the first time, he felt the weight of their failure. They were standing on the brink of something far greater than they had ever imagined. The alien stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "You must decide," it said. "Take the artifact and risk the wrath of forces beyond your control. Or leave it, and let Zyron fall into oblivion." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick and suffocating. John glanced at Nira once more, the weight of the decision pressing on him. "What will we do?" he asked, the question more to himself than to her. John stood still, staring at the alien who had just revealed a truth that shattered everything they had believed in. His mind raced as the weight of the decision loomed over him. Nira's eyes locked onto his, her face. A mask of uncertainty and determination. The alien's words echoed in the back of his mind. The artifact was not a savior, but a prison. A way to keep Zyron isolated and protected from something far more dangerous than the empire that now occupied it. John felt the pressure building in his chest, the realization that their fight had just grown infinitely more complicated. "What's the right choice?" he whispered, more to himself than to Nira. The alien remained silent, waiting. The hum of the energy surrounding the artifact seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Nira moved closer, her hand brushing his as she stepped up to the artifact, her eyes now determined. "We have no choice but to take it," she said, her voice steady, though her hands shook. If we leave it here, Zyron will fall. John's gaze shifted back to the alien, who stood still, watching them. You know what will happen if we take it, the alien said quietly. The forces that you cannot yet comprehend will be unleashed. The artifact is not just a tool of power, it is a key that unlocks far more than you are ready for. John clenched his fists. The future of Zyron, the lives of the people here, hung on a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. But there was no turning back now. He took a step forward, his gaze not leaving the alien. Then let's face whatever comes. Zyron's people deserve a chance. He reached for the artifact, and as his fingers brushed against its glowing surface, a surge of energy rushed through him, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The chamber around them seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Nira gasped, stepping back, as the walls of the chamber began to shift, revealing hidden passageways and chambers beyond. The alien didn't move, its expression unreadable, but its eyes seemed to soften, just a fraction. You are brave, the alien said, its voice filled with a strange, ancient respect. But you do not know what you have awakened. John held the artifact in his hand, its power thrumming through his body. He looked at Nira, who was now standing at his side, her hand resting on her weapon, ready for whatever would come next. They had made their choice, and there was no going back. The future of Zyron, the galaxy, and perhaps the universe itself now rested in their hands. We'll face it together, John said, his voice firm. And with that, they turned toward the newly revealed passages, ready to face whatever was waiting for them beyond. The path ahead was uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The passage ahead of them was dark, the walls lined with strange markings that seemed to shift and change as John and Nira moved through the narrow corridor. The air was thick with tension, every step echoing in the silence that surrounded them. The artifact hummed softly in John's hands, its energy still pulsing through him, making his heart beat faster with each passing second. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had just unlocked something far bigger than themselves. They had been prepared for a fight, for the enemy forces, but this, the force they had just released, felt different. What do you think is waiting for us? Nira asked quietly, her voice a low whisper, as though speaking louder might disturb the air itself. John didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing, trying to piece together everything that had happened so far. The artifact had come with a warning they hadn't fully understood. What had the alien meant when it said they weren't ready? And what was this force it spoke of, beyond the stars? He turned to Nira, his face serious. I don't know, he said honestly. But I know one thing, we can't turn back now. Nira nodded, her gaze steady. Then we moved forward. The passage opened into a vast chamber, the floor covered in a soft, glowing material that seemed to pulse with life. At the center of the room stood an enormous structure, unlike anything John had ever seen before. It looked almost alive, its surface shifting and changing, as though it were made of organic material rather than stone or metal. At the top of the structure, a bright light pulsed, matching the rhythm of the artifact in John's hands. The room was silent, but the energy in the air was palpable, as if the very walls were holding their breath. As John and Nira moved closer, the light above them grew brighter, its intensity increasing until it filled the entire room. The energy in John's hands responded in kind, growing warmer, vibrating with a force he could feel deep within his bones. What is this place? Nira whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum. I don't know, John replied. His eyes were fixed on the glowing light, his mind racing with questions he couldn't yet answer. But one thing was clear. They were at the heart of something far older and more powerful than they had ever imagined. The light suddenly flickered, and for a brief moment, the chamber went completely dark. John's heart skipped a beat. Then, just as quickly, the light returned, but this time it was different. The walls of the chamber seemed to pulse with energy, and in the center of the light, a shape began to form. It was humanoid, its outline faint at first, but as it solidified, John's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall, its features indistinct, but radiating an aura of power and knowledge. It was not human, not even alien by the standards they had come to know. It was something else entirely. Who are you? John asked, his voice steady despite the rising tide of fear in his chest. The figure didn't respond, but its gaze, if it could be called that, seemed to pierce through him. And then, in a voice that seemed to reverberate within his very soul, it spoke. "I am what you have awakened," it said, its voice both ancient and timeless. "And I will show you the path to the stars." The figure's presence was overwhelming, its form shimmering like a mirage in the center of the chamber. John stood frozen, the weight of its words settling over him. "I am what you have awakened," it had said, and the meaning behind those words churned in his mind like a storm. He could feel Nira beside him, her grip tight on her weapon, but even she seemed mesmerized by the strange being in front of them. "What do you want from us?" John asked, his voice steady despite the unease that was growing inside him. The figure didn't respond immediately, but its form shifted slightly, as if it were studying them. For a long moment, the chamber remained silent, the only sound the hum of the energy that pulsed around them. "I do not want anything from you," the figure finally replied, its voice like the echo of a distant memory. "But you will come to understand the consequences of your actions. You have unlocked something ancient, something that should have remained sealed." John's heart raced. This wasn't just about Zyron anymore. This was something far bigger. "What does that mean?" Nira demanded, her voice filled with frustration and fear. The figure's gaze seemed to soften for a brief moment, a flicker of something ancient passing through its eyes. "It means that you have set in motion the return of something long forgotten," it said, its voice carrying a weight of sadness. "A force older than this world, older than your species." The room seemed to grow colder, the very air around them vibrating with the figure's words. John took a step forward, his resolve hardening. "Tell us what we need to do. If this artifact is as important as you say, we need to understand how to stop whatever is coming." The figure tilted its head, as if considering him. "Stop it. You cannot stop what is coming," it said, its voice almost a whisper. "But you can prepare. You can change the course of what is to come. The choice lies with you, but know this. Once you embark on this path, there is no turning back. The path to the stars is not one of peace, but of endless conflict." John looked at Nira, her face set in a grim expression. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, but there was no other choice. They couldn't turn away now. "What do we need to do?" he asked again, his voice resolute. The figure raised a hand, and in that instant, the walls of the chamber seemed to bend and shift, revealing a new path. "Follow this path," it said, "and you will find the knowledge you seek. But be warned, what you discover may change everything you know about the universe. The future is uncertain, and your choices will shape the fate of worlds." As the figure finished speaking, the light in the chamber flickered and dimmed, leaving only the glow of the artifact to guide them. Without a word, John stepped forward, the weight of the figure's warning echoing in his mind. Nira followed closely behind, her footsteps steady but uncertain. Together, they walked down the newly revealed path, knowing that whatever awaited them at the end would change the course of their lives forever. The narrow passageway before them stretched endlessly into the unknown, the air thick with the unfamiliar scent of ancient technology. John's grip tightened around the artifact, the pulse of its energy still flowing through his body, a constant reminder that they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Nira moved ahead of him, her expression set, determined but wary. The figure's words echoed in his mind. The path to the stars is not one of peace, but of endless conflict. They had no choice but to continue, but doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. What if they were making a mistake? What if the forces they were about to face were far beyond their control? "Do you think we can really change anything?" John's voice broke the silence. Nira turned her head slightly, her eyes not meeting his. "I don't know," she said quietly, her words carrying a weight that spoke volumes. "But we don't have a choice, do we? We take this path, or Zyron falls." John nodded, the truth of her words undeniable. The path ahead might be uncertain, but they couldn't turn back. Not now. The passage curved ahead, opening into a large chamber that seemed to hum with energy. At the center of the room, a vast structure stood, its surface covered in glowing symbols. They were similar to the markings they had seen in the earlier passageways, but now, they pulsed with a life of their own. The walls seemed to shift, breathing with a rhythm that matched the beating of John's heart. "What is this place?" Nira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, John replied, his eyes scanning the room, trying to make sense of the strange phenomenon. As they moved forward, the symbols on the walls seemed to react to their presence, shifting and rearranging themselves in intricate patterns. The air grew thicker, the energy around them more palpable, as if the very room itself was alive. At the center of the room, a pedestal rose from the ground, its surface smooth and polished. In the center of the pedestal, a small crystal orb glowed with an intense light. The artifact in John's hands pulsed in response, the energy between the two growing stronger with each passing moment. It's calling to us, Nira said, her voice low, almost reverent. It's like it wants us to take it. John stepped closer to the pedestal, his heart racing. The orb seemed to draw him in, its light now filling the room, overwhelming everything else. As his fingers brushed against its surface, a surge of energy coursed through him, and he felt his mind expand, his consciousness stretching beyond the limits of his body. Visions flashed before his eyes, images of stars, of planets burning, of wars fought across galaxies. He saw Zyron, its people struggling, trapped in a cycle of conflict that seemed to stretch on for eternity. The visions slowed, and he found himself face to face with the alien figure they had encountered earlier, its eyes glowing with an ancient power. This is the truth, the figure said, its voice echoing in John's mind. The path you walk will lead you to knowledge beyond your understanding, but it will also come at a cost. Are you prepared for what lies ahead? John took a deep breath, the weight of the figure's words settling on him. He glanced at Nira, who stood beside him, her gaze focused on the orb. She didn't flinch. We have no choice, John said, his voice steady. We do this together. The figure nodded, its form fading into the light. The energy in the room surged, and the world around them began to shift once more. The path was now clear, but it was a path they would have to walk alone. Together, they reached out and took the orb, knowing that whatever awaited them, they would face it side by side. The moment John and Nira touched the orb, everything around them seemed to dissolve into light. The air crackled with energy, the walls of the chamber bending and twisting as if they were no longer part of the physical world. The orb pulsed with a rhythm that matched the beat of their hearts, and John felt a surge of power rushing through him, like he was becoming one with the very fabric of the universe itself. His mind stretched out, beyond the confines of his body, and he saw visions, flickers of distant stars, swirling galaxies, and strange alien civilizations that he couldn't fully comprehend. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. John was back in the chamber, but something had changed. The orb was still in his hand, its glow dimmed, but the weight of it felt different now, like it had unlocked something deep within him. He looked around, his senses heightened, everything more vivid, more real. Nira's face was just as stunned as his own. What just happened? She whispered, her voice trembling. John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I think we've seen what's to come, he said, his voice steady, but there was a tremor in it. The visions had been too clear, too overwhelming. He could see the future, or at least fragments of it. A war. No, a conflict, far beyond anything they had ever imagined. A force was coming, something ancient and terrifying, and it was reaching for them, for Zyron, and for every world in its path. It's not just about Zyron, John continued, his mind still racing with what he had seen. This is bigger than us, bigger than anything we've ever faced. Nira nodded, her expression hardening. Then what do we do now? How do we stop it? John didn't have an answer. He had seen the destruction, the chaos that lay ahead, but he couldn't see how to stop it. We need to find out more, he said, his voice low. The orb, it's not just a weapon. It's a key, and there's something we haven't unlocked yet. They stood there, in the center of the chamber, the weight of their decisions hanging heavy in the air. They had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The path ahead was uncertain, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. Together, they had taken the first step into the unknown, and it was a step that would change everything. We'll need help, Nira said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting John's. We can't do this alone. John nodded. Agreed. We have to find allies, gather the knowledge we need, and face whatever comes next. Zyron isn't the only world at risk. If we don't stop this, everything will fall. They turned towards the exit, the orb still humming softly in John's hands, guiding them toward the next stage of their journey. They didn't know where it would lead, but they knew one thing for sure. The fate of everything, Zyron, the galaxy, and perhaps the universe, rested on their shoulders. John and Nira walked through the narrow corridor, the weight of their decision settling on their shoulders. The orb, still glowing faintly in John's hand, seemed to hum with the same energy that had flowed through them earlier. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence was heavy, filled with the knowledge of what they had seen and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Their footsteps echoed in the hall, the only sound in a place that had been silent for centuries. What now? Nira's voice finally broke the silence, her words soft, but carrying a weight that John could feel deep in his chest. We find answers, John said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that gnawed at him. He didn't have all the answers, not by a long shot, but he knew they couldn't stop now. Whatever they had unlocked with the artifact, whatever the future held, they had to face it. Together. The alien said we're not ready. That we don't understand what we've set in motion, Nira said, her voice tinged with frustration. How do we even begin to prepare for something like this? John glanced at her, his eyes meeting hers. We start by finding the people who can help us, he said, the determination in his voice cutting through the doubt. There are others out there, other worlds, other civilizations. We can't do this alone. We need to learn as much as we can. Nira nodded, though her expression was still filled with uncertainty. And what about the artifact? She asked. What does it do? How do we control it? John looked down at the orb in his hand. It was still glowing, faintly, but there was a sense of power that radiated from it. He could feel it, deep inside, but he didn't know how to harness it. I don't know yet, he admitted, his voice quiet. But I know it's the key. It's the key to everything. We just have to figure out how to use it. They reached the end of the corridor, where the passage opened up into a large chamber. At the center, a series of glowing consoles lined the walls, their surfaces covered in strange, alien symbols. This looks like a control room, Nira observed, her voice tinged with awe. Maybe we can find some answers here. John nodded, moving toward the nearest console. As he approached, the symbols on the console shifted, almost as if they were reacting to his presence. He reached out and touched the surface, and to his surprise, the console lit up, revealing a holographic map of the galaxy. This is it, John whispered, his heart racing. The map stretched out before them, showing the locations of dozens of planets, star systems, and galaxies. But one area stood out, a cluster of stars on the far edge of the map. The lights on the console blinked rapidly, as if urging him to look closer. What is that? Nira asked, stepping closer to him. I don't know, John replied, his finger tracing the stars. The cluster seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. Then, a new set of symbols appeared on the console, their meaning unclear. A message, perhaps, but it was in a language they didn't understand. We need to learn what this means, John said, his voice filled with determination. This is the next step. As the two of them stood in the control room, staring at the holographic map, the sense of destiny that had been growing within John over the past few days solidified. They were on the verge of something far greater than themselves, something that could change the entire galaxy. But the question remained, what would they find when they followed the map? And more importantly, what would they have to sacrifice along the way? John and Nira stood before the glowing map, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on them. The stars, distant and cold, were now more than just points of light in the sky. They were the key to their future, and possibly the future of the entire galaxy. The map had shown them a path, a direction, but it was more than just a journey through space. It was a journey into the unknown, into the heart of something ancient and powerful. We need to go there, John said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling in his mind. He pointed to the cluster of stars at the far edge of the map, the place that had called to them. That's where we'll find answers. Nira nodded, though her face was a mixture of determination and doubt. But what will we find when we get there? She asked, her voice low. What if it's worse than we think? John turned to face her, his eyes filled with a resolve that he didn't fully feel. We won't know until we go, he said. But we can't just stand here, waiting for something to happen. We have to act. Nira met his gaze, and for a moment, There was silence between them, a quiet understanding that passed without words. Then, she took a deep breath and nodded. All right, let's do it. Together, they turned away from the console, leaving the control room behind. They knew that the journey ahead would be dangerous, filled with uncertainties and challenges they couldn't even begin to imagine. But there was no turning back now. The decision had been made, and they would follow the path laid out before them. They boarded their ship, a sleek vessel designed for long journeys, its engines humming to life as the countdown began. The stars outside the window seemed to shimmer as the ship slowly lifted off the ground. Set course for the cluster, John ordered, his voice calm but firm. Maximum speed. The ship responded with a low hum, the engines working at full capacity as they headed toward the distant stars. The journey would take days, perhaps longer, but the sense of urgency in John's chest pushed him forward. As the stars stretched out before them, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time, against something they didn't fully understand. And with every passing minute, the weight of their mission grew heavier. Nira sat beside him in silence, her eyes fixed on the controls. She wasn't afraid, but she knew that what lay ahead would change everything. "Do you think we're ready for this?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence. John thought for a moment before replying. "No," he said, his voice filled with honesty. "But we don't have a choice. We have to face it, whatever it is." The ship cut through the darkness of space, the stars ahead of them growing larger with every passing hour. The journey was long, but they knew it would be worth it. Whatever awaited them at the cluster of stars, they would face it together. The path was uncertain, but they were no longer afraid. They had a purpose, and they were determined to see it through to the end. As the ship soared through the cold vastness of space, John and Nira stood side by side, watching the stars pass by. The journey had been long, and the silence between them had only deepened their thoughts. Every light in the dark expanse ahead seemed to lead them closer, to something that felt both familiar and terrifying. John couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they were about to find would change everything. He looked at Nira, who was staring at the holographic map of their destination. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing?" he asked, his voice low. Nira didn't look at him right away. Her fingers hovered over the ship's controls, but her gaze was distant, lost in thought. Finally, she spoke. "I wonder if we have a choice," she said quietly. "We found the map, the artifact. It's like it was meant to be. But what if we're not ready? What if we're just walking into something we can't even comprehend?" John turned his attention to the stars outside the window. He had thought the same thing many times. They had no idea what lay ahead, but he had to believe that they could handle it, together. "We're already here," John said. "We've crossed every line we could. Now we can only keep going. And no matter what happens, we face it together." Nira gave a small nod, though her eyes didn't leave the view outside the window. "Together," she repeated, as if trying to convince herself. Hours passed, and as they neared their destination, the atmosphere in the ship became heavier, charged with anticipation. The stars ahead began to form a cluster, the one they had seen on the map. A dense fog of cosmic dust swirled in the distance, and John could feel the pull of something unknown in the air. They were getting closer. Suddenly, the ship's systems flared to life, an alarm blaring through the cockpit. John's hand shot out to the controls, quickly silencing the noise. "What's happening?" Nira asked, her voice sharp with urgency. "Something's blocking our signal," John muttered, his eyes scanning the data on the ship's console. "But we're close. Very close." The stars around them began to shift, forming a narrow path that seemed to lead them toward a strange, glowing object in the distance. "Is that it?" Nira asked, her voice barely a whisper. John nodded, his throat tight. "I think so." The object grew larger as they drew nearer. It wasn't a ship, not like anything they had ever seen. It was more like a structure, an enormous, floating fortress that seemed to pulse with energy, the light from it illuminating the surrounding darkness. The ship continued to approach, and the closer they got, the more the atmosphere seemed to hum with power. John could feel the vibrations in the ship's hull, the energy in the air surrounding them. He turned to Nira, who was now gripping her seat, her face a mixture of awe and fear. "We have to dock," he said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "This is it. Whatever happens next, we have to be ready." As the ship drew closer to the glowing structure, The air seemed to thicken, the energy pressing against them, pulling them into the heart of the unknown. This was the moment. The journey had led them here. Now they had no choice but to face whatever waited for them inside. With a final breath, John set the course. They were ready. But in that moment, a question lingered in his mind. Was anyone ever truly ready for the unknown? The ship gently docked with the enormous floating structure, its hull vibrating with the energy that seemed to pulse from within. John and Nira exchanged a glance, both of them feeling the weight of the moment. They had come so far, crossed lines they never thought they would, and now they stood at the threshold of something that could change everything. The air inside the ship felt thicker, charged with an electric hum as the docking bay doors slowly opened. The glow from the structure outside flooded in, casting long shadows across the cockpit. "This is it," John said quietly, his hand resting on the control panel as he prepared to step out. Nira nodded, her grip tight on her weapon. They had no idea what they would find inside, but they couldn't let fear stop them. Together, they stepped out of the ship and into the unknown. The atmosphere inside the structure was unlike anything they had ever experienced. The walls shimmered with an otherworldly light, patterns shifting and changing in ways that made it impossible to focus on any one thing for long. The air was cool but alive with energy, and as they moved deeper inside, the floor beneath their feet hummed softly. "Where are we?" Nira asked, her voice a mix of awe and wariness. "I don't know," John replied, his voice steady despite the sense of unease creeping up inside him. "But we need to keep moving. Whatever this place is, it's important." They walked further, their footsteps muffled by the strange material beneath them. The path ahead twisted and turned, leading them through a labyrinth of corridors, each one more baffling than the last. The walls seemed to shift as they moved, and the light never seemed to come from any specific source. It was as if the structure itself was alive, watching them, guiding them, or perhaps testing them. "This feels wrong," Nira said, her voice low, barely above a whisper. "Like we're not supposed to be here." John could feel the same thing. The weight of the place pressing down on him, the feeling of being watched from all directions. But they had no choice but to continue. "We're already here," John said, his voice firm. "We need to find answers." As they moved deeper, they came to a large chamber. At the center, a pedestal stood, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols they had seen earlier. And on the pedestal, an object rested, pulsing with the same energy that had guided them here. It was a stone, but unlike anything John had ever seen. Its surface was smooth and dark, almost like obsidian, but it seemed to absorb the light around it, drawing everything in. John felt a shiver run down his spine as he stepped forward. The stone seemed to call to him, its power resonating within him, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Nira's voice broke the silence. "Do you think it's safe?" she asked. John hesitated. The stone felt powerful, but dangerous. He didn't know what it was or what it could do. But there was no turning back. They had come this far, and the answers were within reach. "We need to take it," John said, his voice steady. "This is what we came for." He reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the stone. The moment his skin made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, filling him with visions, images of the past, the present, and the future. He saw civilizations rise and fall, planets destroyed and reborn, and a dark force growing stronger with each passing moment. He saw the destruction of Zyron, but it wasn't just Zyron. It was the galaxy. The entire universe was on the brink of collapse. John staggered back, his mind reeling from the intensity of the visions. Nira grabbed his arm, her voice urgent. "What did you see? What's happening?" John shook his head, trying to steady himself. "It's worse than we thought. Whatever's coming, it's not just a war. It's a force that could destroy everything." He looked at the stone again, its energy still pulsing, its power undeniable. "We have to stop it." John staggered back, his head spinning from the visions the stone had forced upon him. The weight of what he had seen was almost too much to bear. The destruction of entire civilizations, the collapse of galaxies, and the shadow of an ancient force that loomed on the horizon. Everything was falling apart, and the worst part was that they had only just scratched the surface. Nira gripped his arm tighter, her voice filled with urgency. "What did you see, John? What's happening?" Her words seemed to break through the fog in his mind. He shook his head, trying to regain his composure. It's worse than we thought, he said, his voice hoarse. The force that's coming. It's not just a war, it's a cosmic reckoning. It's not something we can fight with weapons or armies. It's something far older, far more powerful than anything we've ever faced. Nira's expression hardened, her determination shining through despite the fear creeping into her eyes. Then what do we do? She asked, her voice steady but filled with resolve. John looked at the stone again, feeling its energy radiating, urging him to understand its true power. He didn't know how to stop it, but he knew one thing. They couldn't just stand by and watch the universe fall apart. We need to find the source, John said, his mind working furiously. The stone, it's part of something much bigger. There's a key here, a way to stop this, but we have to find it before it's too late. He turned away from the stone, his eyes scanning the chamber as if looking for something that would give him the answers he so desperately needed. We need to find the others, he said. There are people out there, civilizations, ancient knowledge. We can't stop this alone. Nira nodded, her expression unwavering. We'll find them. We'll gather all the knowledge we can, no matter what it takes. She paused, then added, but we have to be prepared. This isn't just about saving Zyron anymore. It's about saving everything. John met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. This was bigger than they had ever imagined, bigger than any one world or one battle. The fate of the galaxy was at stake, and they had to act fast. We have to move quickly, John said, his voice resolute. We're running out of time. He turned toward the exit of the chamber, the stone still humming with power in his hand. As they walked, he felt the pressure of their mission growing heavier with each passing moment. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers and unknowns, but they had no choice but to press on. Whatever they were about to face, they would face it together, just as they always had. The future of the galaxy rested on their shoulders, and there was no turning back. Let's go, John said, his voice firm. We'll find the answers, and we'll stop this, no matter the cost. Nira gave a small nod, her determination matching his. Together, they stepped into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey to save the universe had only just begun.